Hey boys. So this is probably gonna annoy a lot of you, but we need to talk. There's a somewhat popular tendency, especially online, where people who present themselves as leftists just kind of form their conclusions entirely by taking the exact opposite position of the US political establishment and mainstream media, and then trying to justify them post hoc. Now I, for example, am a socialist, which means, in very, very simplified terms, that I base my politics on one simple thing: aiming for the best for the majority of people while causing the least amount of harm possible. And I myself do oppose the US government because I believe that it has a very, very long history of serving corporate interests at any cost, both at home and abroad, and it's pretty much the same, if not worse, today. Whether that means them overthrowing foreign governments, supporting dictatorships, starting wars, or oppressing and neglecting their own citizens just in order to protect industries that profit from their suffering, they really do it all. They just have no limits whatsoever. But my reason for opposing them is not just it's the USA. Rather, it's because the actions that I just outlined are completely antithetical to my politics and morality. There are also other governments that I'm opposed to for the same reason. For example, I have no time for the government of China, largely due to the fact that they run a state capitalist hellscape that does nothing for the workers. That's gonna get me cancelled. Or the government of Iran, because it's a far-right theocracy and its primary means of controlling protests is to fire machine guns into them. And that's where I differ from what I hereby dub the contrarian fanatics, who have no consistent beliefs, values, or politics beyond US aligned is bad, US opposed is good. Allow me to introduce you to the main subjects of this video, who are probably the most prominent expression of this. You might have heard of them, the Grayzone. But I want to stress here that this video is not just about them. There's plenty of other contrarian fanatics out there, and the Grayzone is just a prominent example to use to explore this tendency. So they're a supposedly journalistic establishment that is dedicated to opposing anything that the US government and political establishment does or says, no matter what. And I don't think that alone is bad at all, actually. Basically, all of what the USA does sucks ass. Or at the very least, any position that it takes, it does so for self-serving purposes. Even if very, very occasionally it sometimes fumbles into accidentally doing something good, like joining World War II, for example. Well, at least if we ignore the two big things that it did at the end. Okay, let's scratch that example then. What I do think is dumb is the fact that they take this to the next level. If the USA is opposed to something, anything, then for them that thing is automatically saintly good. No exceptions whatsoever. This results in them being staunch, completely uncritical supporters of what I like to call the sextuple. I don't actually like to call them that. That's probably the first time I've ever said that word in my life. The governments of China, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, and Syria. Now, I wouldn't say that I particularly oppose all of those governments myself, especially not that of Venezuela, as I still consider Maduro, for all of his faults, to be nowhere near as bad as handing the country over to be ravaged by the neoliberal, US-aligned opposition. And I totally acknowledge that US interest in their affairs is just based completely on self-interest. And the USA does practically everything that it accuses its opponents of doing, and also directly and violently meddles in the affairs of other countries, much more than any other. And they obviously don't care at all about the people of those countries, regardless of how often they scream about democracy and freedom as a rhetorical tool. But on the other hand, neither do the governments of those countries themselves. You see, the fact that the USA is hypocritical and calls others out even though it does the same or worse stuff doesn't magically absolve the other party. But for the Grayzone and other contrarian fanatics, it absolutely does. Anything said by the US government or media about those governments must immediately be countered with the exact opposite. When they're accused of doing something heinous or being oppressive or whatever, they deny it. If some figure or politician is being derided, they lavish praise upon them. It's just really like an automatic, childish response. Like, yes, the US government and media absolutely lie about stuff. But it's not like we know that, for example, China is an oppressive state capitalist surveillance state that uses communist aesthetics while giving the workers next to nothing, just because the US media tells us that. The Chinese government's policies are available from many sources, including the Chinese government themselves, and any leftist reading of them will come to this conclusion very fast. Unless you're looking to apologize for them, that is. For example, did you know this communist country literally doesn't have universal healthcare after what, like 70 years?
Yes.
Here's an article about 3 Chinese people from the same family literally dying because they couldn't afford healthcare in China. For comparison, Cuba literally immediately after the revolution took power started eliminating for-profit healthcare, and it finished implementing its comprehensive universal healthcare system just 16 years later. The fact that the Grayzone and its journalists just completely ignore all of this to instead run interference for China, such as by outright supporting China against the Hong Kong protests with literally zero room for nuance, and of course denying the ongoing Uyghur cultural genocide, makes it pretty damn clear that anything resembling consistent leftist ideals aren't what's driving the Grayzone and others like them. The USA and China are rivals, so any denouncement of China by the USA must immediately be spun in the exact opposite direction, and any and all movements that the USA voices support for must be delegitimized. In the Grayzone's coverage of the Uyghur situation, they continually selectively attack reports from the American right wing, presenting them as if just because the American propaganda machine says it's happening, that means it isn't. Of course, they make no mention of the fact that we have a lot more evidence than that, such as terrifying videos of prisoners, and scores of eyewitness testimonies from refugees.
My mother, Hajar Gulnur, 54 years old. She is a housewife. She hasn't been involved in anything illegal. She was taken away to China's so-called re-education campus. My brother-in-law,
They even uncritically print a euphemistic statement from the Chinese government itself, as if that's it, what the Chinese government says goes. They then go on to try and justify the Chinese oppression in East Turkestan by painting the Uyghur as violent extremists. The implication is clear, they're basically saying, and if there were camps, they would be justified. How about some other examples from the rest of the sextuple? To be topical, here's them feeling the impulse to present the recently murdered by the USA General Soleimani of Iran as some kind of incredible saintly figure, and any criticism of him being simply discounted as the narrative.
And leaders like Qasem Soleimani were the leading forces in defeating ISIS.
We also are hearing from Western politicians and corporate media pundits that Soleimani was responsible for repressing Iranians domestically through the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. What was his role in terms of domestic Iranian affairs? It appears as though he's someone who's been outside of the country mostly.
Well, again, this is the whole narrative. I mean, he murders pregnant women and he hangs children. That's how, that's the narrative on Iran.
Now yes, that was a guest rather than any of the hosts themselves, but they didn't challenge a thing he said and gave him easy questions with expected answers, like this one.
Let's talk about why these funeral processions have been so large. Soleimani's impact stretched far beyond Iran and even beyond his recent victories over the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Can you give us a brief picture of who he was and why he was revered by so many across the region?
It's obvious that they agree with him, and in the wake of this assassination, they want to make Soleimani look good. Now, obviously, what the USA did was not only flagrantly illegal, but morally reprehensible. But that doesn't mean that we need to pretend that the top military commander of a far-right theocratic dictatorship was someone worthy of our staunch admiration. Someone who literally signed a letter from the military to the Prime Minister in 1998, saying that they would carry out a coup if he didn't massacre student protesters, and who, as the top military commander, has been directly and intimately involved in the command structure of a government that routinely massacres scores of protesters like it's nothing. Yup, he pursued Iran's geopolitical interests in Syria, and that involved an important contribution to defeating ISIS. Again though, that doesn't magically erase the rest of what he's done. And if we allow it to do so, then we're basically being like the people who always say, hey, but the US has done some good things too, why do you only talk about the bad? He's still the top military commander of an oppressive far-right theocracy, and not someone to be celebrated by anyone who isn't aligned with such ideals. And if you think, well, it wouldn't have been right to talk about this when the USA is threatening a war with Iran, I totally agree with you, but that's also no reason to beatify the guy, because assassinating an official of a foreign state in another foreign state that he's in at the invitation of that state's government is absolutely indefensible unless it was Henry Kissinger, and whether he was terrible or amazing is irrelevant to that. Grayzone and others turn it into a moral thing, where actually the real reason that it's bad is because Soleimani is an anti-imperialist lion. Because that's just what contrarian fanatics do. Now how about some Max Blumenthal in Venezuela? Oh, it's getting hot in here. Here's Blumenthal informing everyone that actually the government provides everyone with affordable food, so there's no crisis in Venezuela. Everything is actually A-okay.
We are in Parroquia Macarao in the outskirts of Caracas at a food market where food is being sold below market value, subsidized. Salted fish. ¿Puedo probarlo? Sí. Tengo hambre, entonces. It's pretty good, it's really good.
You see that, folks? It tastes really good. There's no problems here at all.
And here we have ground up chicken made in Venezuela, which is being sold for about $1.25.
Okay, so that's about 300 grams of processed chicken being sold for $1.25. It's being presented as if it's affordable. Is it? Well, since last year the minimum wage in Venezuela was $16 a month. No, it's not. But of course the viewer isn't being presented with this information, because Max Blumenthal isn't here to inform the audience, he's here to advance the idea that there's no crisis in Venezuela. Everything is just totally fine. And in his quest to present Venezuela as perfect, he even gets distracted by the scenery.
And also what you can see are train tracks, because there's an actual metro system in Caracas that services this community. The infrastructure is actually pretty decent.
Look, they even have trains here. Who would have thought, right? Trains in Latin America? Incredible. Nice one, Max. That surely is an incredibly advanced city where everything is totally fine, unlike what the narrative tells us.
This is the bread stand. It's really cheap. So it's being sold, the large breads are being sold for 2,000 bolivares, which is less than $1 for all that bread.
Less than $1 for all that bread, you hear that? There's so much bread, just 1/16 of your monthly salary. There is no crisis here at all. Hey, wanna know where else you can get bread for less than $1? Well, here in Argentina, this loaf of bread is 70 cents. And it's also in a private supermarket, not in a special humanitarian market. And the minimum wage is also $289 a month, so it's about a 412th of your monthly salary rather than like an 18th or a 20th. And if I'd bothered to go into a bakery, which I don't usually do because I hate talking to people, it'd be even cheaper. When a wealthier, more expensive country that is also in the middle of a huge crisis is matching your solidarity prices, there's clearly a huge problem. Blumenthal is taking advantage of the fact that these prices seem good to someone from a rich first world English-speaking country like the USA, Britain or Australia, but relative to income in Venezuela, they're terrible, and relative to the rest of the continent, they're still very average. The issue in Venezuela isn't a lack of supply, it's affordability. Even in these subsidized markets, everything is still far too expensive for the average wage earner, and the government's actions have played a significant part in this. because they've fixed the exchange rate for years. Since foreign trade is based on the official exchange rate of the dollar rather than the parallel exchange rate that accurately reflects its actual value, which is about 30% lower, importers are charged more by suppliers to make up the difference. This in turn drives up the prices of locally produced goods to match, especially those that use any imported materials or ingredients. Even according to leftist economists such as Mark Weisbrot, this has been the primary cause of the hyperinflation crisis. And the incredibly low wages relative to the high prices of even subsidized goods are the reason that most Venezuelans are having so much trouble getting by, unless they're being sent extra money by family or friends who are working overseas. And this is precisely what's driving a lot of the migration out of Venezuela. Remittances from abroad have become almost a requirement for the working class to be able to get by. And don't you dare try to tell me that every Venezuelan living abroad is just some rich kid who's living in Miami or whatever. There are a lot of those in English-speaking spaces, and yeah, absolutely call them out. But I live in Argentina and I've met countless Venezuelans working minimum wage jobs and sending like half of their salary back home to help maintain their family. And there's far more Venezuelans elsewhere doing the same, in Colombia and Peru for example. Of course though, you're not going to hear anything about this from the Grayzone. There's no crisis at all. Actually, everything's cheap and abundant. It's really tasty and there's even a train. Toot toot. Here's some more of the Grayzone's reporting on Venezuela.
Okay, so I had a pretty normal experience at the supermarket. I was able to get pretty much everything that I usually get back home in the States, including like this bag of craft beer, until my credit card didn't work and I had to pay in cash. I paid in dollars, and that really shows what the problem is here, that I had to pay in dollars. There isn't an issue here with food distribution or food scarcity. The issue is the buying power of Venezuelans has been completely destroyed because their currency has been so badly weakened by hyperinflation, speculation, and the flood of dollars that the government can't control here, as well as hoarding by private capitalist elements that support the opposition and are making a ton of money off of this kind of economic war.
In this one, he actually acknowledges what the problem is, he just frames it as something that's not remotely the government's fault. He actually makes them sound kind of like a victim. It's nothing to do with the artificially overvalued currency, the government is just a victim of the speculators and the tyranny of the dollar. Except in the government market, everything was also unaffordable, so maybe the government did actually have a little something to do with it, don't you think? Nah, rather than acknowledging the fixed exchange rate as a problem in of itself, he presents it as a good thing and the government like it's in some sort of righteous fight to prevent the flow of illicit dollar transactions. But the parallel market is hardly something illicit. It's incredibly everyday. Everyone participates in it. Now look, the opposition and the elite have definitely done a lot to contribute to the crisis, and the new sanctions since 2017 have definitely not helped one bit. But hyperinflation began before sanctions had any real impactful effects. And it could have been avoided entirely if Maduro had listened to the advice of leftist economists who had advised him back in 2016. One of their biggest recommendations was suggesting that he float the currency. Other elements have a lot to answer for too here, sure, but so does Maduro. The government could have done a lot of things differently and perhaps even avoided hyperinflation entirely, but they did not. You'd never hear even just milquetoast criticism of Maduro from the Grayzone though. He's an opponent of the US, so he's automatically perfectly good. Lastly on Venezuela, there's this embarrassing video where Blumenthal repeatedly implies that there's no crisis in Venezuela because people in a luxury mall are doing just fine.
Again, this is, as you can see, it's a real opposition stronghold. People are on board for Guaido. They want the humanitarian aid. These people, I mean, the crisis is just hitting hard here.
So rich people are insulated from the problems of the majority in a time of crisis. Thank you. I believe we all knew that already. Maybe the best place to seek out evidence of a crisis then isn't in a luxury mall. But nope, because the rich people are doing just fine and can still afford their luxuries, everything's just peachy. I really find their Venezuela reporting kind of gross actually. They didn't go there because they wanted to honestly report on the situation and its people, rather they traveled with preconceived conclusions that they just set out to support. They're concerned much more with validating themselves themselves than they are with actually giving a voice to anyone around them. For them, Venezuela and its people are nothing but objects to be used to prove themselves right and the USA wrong. The Venezuelan working class need a voice in the international media, but these rich Americans on a fun little tour to this exotic South American country, which they appeared surprised to find has trains, were only interested in talking to those who would help them to further their thesis. It's not journalism any more than when, say, Jorge Ramos went to Venezuela.
Ahora, no es periodista, Jorge, tú lo sabes.
It's just the same thing from the other side. Other examples of the Grayzone's contrarianism are its endless support for Assad, denying his war crimes and attacking basically anyone that they consider to be opposed to him. I think this is quite notable because Ben Norton, who made his name writing this stuff, actually used to be a big anti-Assad guy just like 3 or 4 years ago, and all of a sudden he just changed his tune and started writing nothing but pro-Assad stuff and deleted all of his anti-Assad stuff with no explanation whatsoever. Here is a Ben Norton article where he tries to delegitimize the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are led by the Rojavans, who are also pretty much the only actors in this entire conflict who even remotely deserve anyone's critical support, since they are overt leftists who represent a minority that is oppressed in 4 countries just because they formed an alliance of convenience with the USA to protect themselves against ISIS and other extremist groups. Here's more of his tweets on the topic. There's this one, which is just more of the same thing, and this one with bonus, actually it's wrong to show solidarity with murdered Iranian protesters. This is the contrarian impulse in full swing. Actual leftists are doing nothing but fighting for self-determination in their own homeland, but simply because they accept help from the USA, they absolutely must be attacked and delegitimized. And back in 2017, Norton made a series of explicitly anti-Putin tweets where he called him a right-wing, anti-leftist reactionary. Yet apparently Assad, who is supported by said right-wing anti-leftist reactionary, does not deserve any criticism for that. The only ones deserving of criticism for their military alliances are the actual leftist ethnic minority. Again, because it's about nothing more than picking a side based off what the USA opposes. Ben Norton's been eerily quiet on Putin since condemning him back in 2017. I don't know, perhaps he was reprimanded for it or something, because he's since moved on to delegitimizing any criticism of Russia along with the rest of the Grayzone staff. Case in point, here's Max Blumenthal justifying Russia's literal invasion and annexation of the Crimea. But again, Russia and the USA, geopolitical rivals. Russian imperialism good, US imperialism bad. In fact, Blumenthal is so friendly to Russia that sometimes literal Russian government accounts tag him in their tweets, because I guess they know that they can rely on him to just uncritically spread their narrative for them. If your contrarianism is so strong that a far-right reactionary government considers you its ally in the information wars, I think you're doing something very, very, very wrong. The Grayzone and its contributors also report on Russiagate constantly. Now, I have more sympathy for them there because they're mostly right. Russians posting Facebook memes did not lose Hillary Clinton the election. But combined with their other stuff on Russia and their overall contrarianism, it's clear what their motivations are. It's just a case of a broken clock being right twice a day. Now, I'm guessing by now that some people have already stopped watching and left a comment like, "The Grayzone is good. They're just providing counterbalance to the mainstream media, and it's wrong to get all critical of targets of US imperialism at delicate times. Also, shit lib." For the first part, doing what the mainstream media does but the other way around is hardly the right approach to take. And especially not when, by doing so, you're throwing the working class of other countries under the bus by defending terrible governments. Our ideas stand up for themselves, so any simple, honest, and ethical reporting is inherently advantageous to us. Just take a look at The Intercept for an excellent example of this. What the Grayzone does just serves to delegitimize and disqualify their reporting in the minds of many people whose minds could otherwise be changed. It ensures that they just end up preaching to the choir rather than making any real difference to anything. Worse, actually, their work misleads leftists into into supporting terrible governments and towards this simplistic contrarianism. And as to the second bit, I absolutely agree. But that doesn't make it okay to just totally whitewash these governments and figures in these delicate times either. We're right to be anti-war and against imperialist intervention and meddling, and the moral character of the governments of these countries doesn't change that. The Iranian government can be bad, and US meddling in wars against Iran can also be bad. Or for another example, whether or not Maduro's policies contributed to the crisis, all of the garbage that the opposition does is not remotely okay. Nor is it okay for the USA to declare some random dipshit president while doing everything they possibly can to ensure the crisis continues and that the Venezuelan people suffer. It is very, very wrong to wage war or intervene in the affairs of another country to benefit the elite of your own. And since that's precisely what the USA does, we're right even if we don't mention anything at all about these governments. Now, I'm also not trying to say that it's some huge crime to have a bad take or whatever now and again, but there's a bit of a difference between having a bit of a soft spot for China or Iran or making jokes about them or whatever, and literally just sincerely taking the exact opposite position of the US and its media every single time, as people like the Grayzone and I've got 1,000 flags in my username Twitter do. So to finally conclude here, you should absolutely engage with the mainstream media with a ton of skepticism, and also basically just ignore everything that the US government says about everything. But that's a very far cry from if the US government or media says something about something, then the opposite must be true. Simple contrarian opposition to the government of one state like this cannot be the basis of your ideology. Rather, actual principles in politics applied consistently, though with some consideration for extenuating circumstances, must be.
Excellent work, Agent BadEmpanada. You will find your payment at these coordinates. We're proud to have you on board with the CIA's Anti-Grayzone Task Force. Thanks to you, the very real threat of extremely online dangus will be controlled. Excuse me, ignore that. My brother hacked my phone. Anyway, thanks for watching. Just to let you guys know, I've got a new second channel now called Empanada Report, where I'll be uploading shorter, lower effort videos. So go check that out if you want. Anyway, if you happen to really like my content, consider supporting me on Patreon, becoming a member on YouTube, or sending me a one-time donation on Ko-fi. It all really helps. Now I'd just like to thank all of my patrons and especially the following: Tonga Purutuneha, Super Pancake Man, Jesse Hosick, Key to the Fields, Industrial Robot, One Trash Boy, Cincioni Brezgal, Morimur, Igor Dorzak, Mamushin, Violet Rain, Nico of the Cestus, Audrin and Nate Thorne, Kira B, Lautaro, Christoph Kaczynski, Derek, Diego Asalvati, and Shantanav.